In this chapter, it discussed the Civil Rights Act, as well as the Equal Pay and Age Discrimination Acts. It also touched on constitutional provisions and the affirmative action. So as far as the Civil Rights Act goes, in 1886, it stated all persons in the U.S. have the same right to make and enforce contracts while having the full benefit of the law. In 1871, it stated it prohibits discrimination by state and local governments. For the Equal Pay Act of 1963, it said statute that prohibits wage discrimination based on sex, talked about equality based on skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Moving on into the Age Discrimination Act, it also talked about statute that prohibits employers from refusing to hire or discriminate against people in terms of employment based on their age. Moving on to another act, it's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It stated it prohibits discrimination in employment against otherwise qualified persons who have a handicap. Piggybacking onto that, Americans with Disabilities Act of 1991 states it requires employers to make reasonable accommodations to the known disabilities of an otherwise qualified job applicant and or employee with a disability. Rounding off the chapter, it talked about affirmative action. To describe it, it is programs adopted by employers to increase the representation of women and minorities in their workforces. It may constitute reverse discrimination. And then how this relates back to everyday life, I said it relates back to everyday life because the Civil Rights Act still resonates in the United States by prohibiting discrimination in public and federally funded programs. Moving on to chapter 22, this chapter talked about the environmental protection agencies and numerous acts regarding air, water, and hazardous waste regulations. So here it gave two examples for approaches to the environmental protection. The first one was government subsidies, the government subsidies approach, and the emission charges approach. Moving on into the definition of Environmental Protection Agency. What that is, it's a federal agency responsible for conducting an integrated, coordinated attack on all forms of environmental pollution. Building off of that, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 stated it requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement. Like I said, it talked about the regulation of water quality. This was achieved through a system of permits and effluent discharge limitations. What came with this was the Safe Water Drinking Act that set standards for drinking water supplied by a public water supply system. Moving on into regulating air quality, it included the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. This is also known as NAAQS. It also included state implementation plans, new source review programs, and the acid rain control program. To round out this chapter, it talked about the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. This encouraged further progress by providing information and incentive grants to spur innovation. And the responses of the U.S. in establishing global environment policies included research, conferences, treaties, and aid. And how this relates back to everyday life, it relates back because according to EPA.gov, as of September 30th of 2021, they're increasing their budget by $16 million to help fund the clean water and drinking water funds to ensure that there is clean water and clean drinking water. So